A natural outflow of that series that we just did on prayer is to move into the series that we're doing now called Miracles. And so we're starting a new series today called Miracles, as Colton mentioned, and it is a journey actually through the book of John, which I'll explain in a second. So specifically miracles in the book of John. And inevitably, it seems like every time we talk about miracles, there's going to be two words that come to the surface that you'll hear people talk about, or they'll reference, or they'll say, and these words might be the most misused or misunderstood words that we use in our Christian jargon. And the words are faith and believe. And so when we think about the word believe outside of the context of church and faith communities, we talk about belief in a different kind of way. We talk about belief that we believe things based on logic, based on reason, that you've come to some kind of conclusion based on what you've seen, what you've observed, what you've studied, and this is your belief system. Or you believe something, so we come to a belief based on that, or we believe something because we trust somebody that told us something, and we believe because we trust them, and they're a trustworthy source. And those are typically two of the ways that we come to some form of opinion or belief around something. However, when Christians start talking often, and we start talking about the Bible, and we start talking about faith and belief, it's often like we almost talk about it in a different kind of definition. You just got to believe, and we talk about it like that's in place of reason and logic, like throw your reason and logic away. Don't use your brain. Just believe it. Or we have the term blind faith, or you just got to have faith, or you just believe it. And you're like, how am I supposed to believe something that I don't believe? Anybody ever feel that? Let's be honest here. How am I supposed to believe something I don't believe? And people's like, no, you just got to believe it. You just got to have faith. Why do we transpose the meaning or change the meaning of the words in one context and not the other? And if you were to go to the writers of the Bible, you go to Jesus himself, or you go to Peter, or as we're going to look at John, they were going to, if you said you just got to believe and throw reason and logic, they would say, you're crazy. That is not what we're talking about. And some of us in this room, have grown up with this idea of blind faith, and you were just told to believe something. You just got to believe it. And maybe you grew up in church, like you just got to believe it. And you had some questions and you had some doubts, and you're like, okay, I'm going to just check my brain at the door. I'm told to believe it. My parents told me that, or my pastor told me that. And so I'm not going to think about my questions and my doubts. I'm just going to try and believe it. And then you go through life like trying to believe it. And then all of a sudden, you read a book and you're like, I believe that book. I don't know if I believe what I believed. Or you talk to somebody else, or you watched a YouTube video or something, and you're like, oh, I don't know if I believe it anymore, because you never really believed it to begin with. John, when he's writing his book, would tell you, don't just believe something just because somebody told you. Don't just believe something that is contrary to your logic and your reasoning. He is trying to tell you, believe something because it is reasonable, because it is logical. When you weigh the evidence of what God is doing, what has happened, it's worthy of your belief. And the word believe and faith in the Bible are the exact same word. It's the same root word. Believe is the verb of the word, and faith is the noun. But it both comes from the word pistis in the Greek, which is translated either believe in the verb form or faith in the noun form. And this word really has more to do with trust. And so, yes, there's an intellectual component to it, but it's not just that. Do you trust what you're seeing? Do you trust what you're hearing? Do you trust the person you're listening to? And so it's not about checking your brain at the door, but it's actually about being discerning about the thing that you put your trust and your weight into. And so John, the Gospel of John, or the good news according to John, is the last of the four Gospels written. And by the time that John is writing, this is probably 70 years after the events that he's writing about, he's an old man. His friends are gone. The other disciples that he kind of grew up with, that he had these experiences with, that he followed Jesus with, most of them at this point had been martyred. And this is actually significant, that there was a group of unbelieving, doubtful, tentative teenagers that came to a place where they were willing to believe something, to trust something to the point that they would give up their very own lives instead of denying what they saw what they experienced. There should be a weight to that. There should be a weight to the testimony. So John himself is in his old age. His friends had, because of their belief, because of their trust in who Jesus was and what they had experienced, gave their lives up. And John is sitting around, and there's probably people that are like, John, you got to write this stuff down. Mark wrote down Peter's account. Matthew wrote down stuff. Luke researched stuff extensively and wrote down all the things and is like, you have your own experiences. You ought to write down your experiences as well. And so John's book, it's actually my favorite. It's probably my favorite book in the Bible. So I'm very excited to work through it. But the reason I love John is because it's like his writing came from decades and decades of reflection. And you can see it how he organized it. He doesn't organize anything by chance. He uses every story, every image, every number. Everything has significance and it's thoughtful. And he has a motive and a purpose behind why he's writing what he's writing. He didn't just write down everything, but he strategically and intentionally wrote down some things. And he tells us why. When you write papers in college or university or even high school, they tell you to write your thesis statement. Like, why are you writing this? Like, what's your main idea? What's your purpose? And John puts his thesis statement right at the end of his gospel. And this is what he says. He says, Jesus performed many other signs. This is going to be a very important word that we're going to come back to every single week. We'll just put it on the shelf for a second. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Now listen, pay attention. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so this is, in Greek they refer to this as a hina clause because that's the word that is translated from. It's a purpose clause. It's this, because of this, that. Okay? So I've written these signs down, these miracles down. And the reason I've recorded all these things wasn't just to tell you what happened, but I actually wrote it down for a reason. And that reason was that you would believe. Not in spite of your reason or your logic, or you'd check your brain at the door, but you would actually bring your brain and your heart, the whole thing, and you would put your trust into the testimony that I'm telling you. Why? Because I was there. I was with Jesus this whole time. I saw it. And what the other disciples wrote about, I'm telling you, it's true. And that you can believe in it intellectually, you can trust in it relationally, you can place your hope in it. And my reason for writing this is that you would see the truth to which everything that I told you is pointing towards. That you would change the way that you're living because of what I've written. And that you would believe that Jesus, you would trust that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the one that you've been waiting for, that he's the Son of God. And that by believing, by putting your hope and your trust in him, that you would have life in his name. And if you have been around Sunwest for any length of time, you've probably heard me talk about this word life. This word life, he's not using the word just like breathing or existing. That would be the Greek word bios, where we get the word biology from. He's not saying, I hope that you would just continue on breathing. That's why you would believe in his name. That's what he's talking about. Zoe life. And in John, and you'll remember the passage of John 3:16, he refers to eternal life, everlasting, unending Zoe life, and Zoe is life in all of its fullness. Life the way it was meant to be lived. And so we're in this room together, or you're watching online, and you're listening because you have bios, you have biological life. You are here, you're present, your eyes, your ears are working, you're breathing, but you might just be surviving. You might feel like life is empty. You might be wondering about the purpose of life. You might be discouraged. John is saying, I didn't just write this down for you to survive. I didn't just write this down for you to get by. I actually wrote this down so that you could experience fullness of life today and forever. That's why I wrote this. That's why I wrote about these miracles, these things that I saw. Now, in our culture, we have a hard time with miracles. People have a hard time believing in miracles because supposedly we live in a very rationalistic, scientific world. I question that sometimes. I don't think people are making much decisions these days based on logic and reason, but I digress. We say, we don't believe in miracles because we're rational, scientific people, and miracles are contrary to science and logic. And so we live in this veil, we live in this world where miracles are kind of looked at with suspicion. And if you believe in miracles, you're looked at as a little bit crazy. Well, first of all, if you're a Christian, you believe in miracles. The very basis and foundation of Christianity is a miracle. The death and resurrection of Jesus is a miracle. And so if you accept on some level that is a true and actual event that has changed history, you have already taken a stance that you believe in miracles. Now, of course, like I said, logic and reason, it has its place. And logic and reason will tell us that there is rules, there's laws of nature, there's things that always happen, and these laws are, they're consistent. You can take them to the bank. And so if I were to take this ball and I were to drop it, what is going to happen? Or the table, yeah. So I drop it. What's going to happen the next time I drop it? Okay, what about this time? How long do you want to do this for? We can keep going? We could be here all day. How much money would you bet when I release this ball it's going to hit the table? You'd bet a lot of money, wouldn't you? Okay, and so we could say there's a law of nature. There is gravity. This will happen over and over and over again. And I don't need to think this is rational scientific reality, right? Unless, you see what I did there? Did it hit the table? No. Why? Well, because I am a independent, free-thinking being with some agency and some ability and some capacity to do something in time and space that changes the reality in which that we're living. You guys agree? Okay. So if God is real and He exists and He is powerful and He created this world and He created something out of nothing and He's a being with agency and will and capacity and ability. And that is, let's just think logically for a second. If that is true, just like I am a being of agency and will, then can God not interrupt laws of things, rhythms of things, predictability of things, and do something that we don't expect? So some of you, we go through life, and this is gravity, but we go through life in relationships. We're like, this is never going to change. We go through health. This is my diagnosis. This is never going to change. I don't know if you know, but if you go to it was something I was really encouraged about on that board over there. I think there's 3 or 4 cases of cancer being healed. Very cool. We look at the events in our world and we're like, this is never going to change. Look what's happening in Israel. Look what's happening in Iran. Look what's happening in Nigeria. And we think, if we're just going to go with predictability, it's very, very depressing. But if we choose to dare to believe in what John is telling us, perhaps there is something more. And so, miracles. John doesn't refer to them as miracles, however. He referred to them as what? Signs. So what John is trying to tell us is that there are things that God has done in history, that He has experienced, that He has seen, that has interrupted the predictable flow of things. And many people end up just infatuated with those events. Did you hear about the story? But John is saying that wasn't even the point. He refers to them as a sign. So if you were rolling into Calgary, you'd see a sign like this, right? Welcome to Calgary, Blue Sky City. And I'd say, that sign is Calgary. You'd be like, that is a stupid thing to say. That's what you would tell me. That's illogical. That sign is not Calgary. You'd be like, that sign is telling you that now you're getting into the proximity of Calgary. That sign is telling you if you keep going, there's a city that is beyond the sign that's called Calgary that people live in, right? The sign is not the point, but the sign is pointing to a reality that is the point, right? You're following me. This is what John's theology of the miracles is, that every miracle is a sign. Every miracle is not the end in and of itself. The word miracle in Greek is dunamis, which is where you get the word dynamite from. That's not the word that John uses. And sometimes we think that like the sign is like the explosion, it's the dynamite. We're like, that's the thing. John's like, it's just a sign. It's just pointing you towards a greater reality. There's like glimpses of a reality breaking into this world that everything you're experiencing, everything that you think is normal and real isn't all there is to know and see. And so he goes through these signs in the book of John, and he has 7 signs. And so each of the 7 weeks we are going to look at one of the 7 signs. And as we look at those signs, yes, we're going to be, these are cool stories, cool events, dynamite type of stories. But John's saying this isn't like actually the point. And so as we go through these miracles, what we're also going to realize is what these signs, what these miracles tell us about who God is, what the kingdom of God is like. That we might trust in God, have hope in God, and know that he is, whatever reality or normal that we're living in, he is pointing to a greater reality, and that's what the signs are pointing towards. So the first sign number 1, is water to wine. And it's found in John chapter 2. I was going to read this earlier, but let me just read it right now before we jump into John 2. John 1, this is how John starts it. He says, this is the way he starts his book. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. So there was nothing, and then God got into it. Some kind of big bang, so to speak, that something began. There was nothing in the beginning except the Word. And this Word was a person, and this person was with God in the beginning. And through him, all things were made. And without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, Zoe life, the fullness of life. And that life was the light of mankind. That light shines in the darkness, and darkness shall not overcome it. And then John goes on to say that the Word became flesh in verse 14. The Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood, made his dwelling among us. So the Word of God invaded time and space and history and disrupted what was happening. And then you continue reading from John, and then we get to John the Baptist, and John the Baptist is baptizing people saying there's a Messiah, he's coming, he's going to change everything. And John had some disciples, and then when Jesus shows up, John points at Jesus and he says, look, there's a Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And so right on John 1, John the disciple says, God invades history. Then we get to John the Baptist, and John the Baptist says, don't look at me, look at him. You see what's happening? To his disciples, he's saying, don't follow me, follow him. This is John the disciple. So it's John the Baptist, John the disciple, right? I'm not trying to confuse you. But the whole point of everything from John 1, John 2, leading up to the sign story is pointing people, it's a sign pointing people to Jesus. Saying that Jesus is the one that we ought to be looking at. Jesus is the one that we ought to be following. Jesus is the one that changes everything. John says, don't look at me, John the Baptist. Look at Jesus. John the writer is writing this, he's saying, don't look at the signs as miracles at the end of themselves. Look at what they're pointing towards. They're pointing towards Jesus. So now we get to sign number 1, water to wine. And this is what it reads. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So there's this wedding that's taking place in Cana in Galilee, which is way north of Jerusalem. Jesus' mother was there, and we'll find out that she was part of the party planning committee. She was in some way a wedding planner, working with the families to plan this wedding. And then Jesus was invited, and his disciples. I don't know who in the right mind would invite these disciples to the wedding. These are young teenagers. So let me give a word of advice for those of you who are planning on getting married. I was like, don't just invite all your friends. You know why? Because they don't bring good gifts. You want good wedding gifts at your wedding? You got to invite some adults that have some money in their bank account. All your friends that you're filling up all those seats with, waste of spots, I'm telling you. So Jesus shows up with all of his young teenager disciples. They're not bringing any wedding gifts, but they're there. And in that culture, a wedding would happen over the course of about 7 days. It's a week-long party. So it's a lot to plan. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of people. And so Jesus and his disciples are there. Mary is helping. Jesus' mom is helping with the planning and the execution of the wedding. When the wine was gone, so the wine all ran out. And so in this culture, this would be a very bad scenario. This would be like people showing up to your reception dinner and there's actually no food and everybody's hungry. People would be disgruntled. There would be shame on the family. And so this was a big deal in that culture at that time. And for some of you, this would be a really big deal that there wasn't any wine. And we have groups for that. So you can come. So when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." And so Mary says to Jesus, they have no more wine, because she assumes that Jesus can do something about it, which actually makes me wonder about why does Mary assume Jesus can do something about it? And we don't, other than one story, we don't have any story about Jesus' childhood. But I can imagine Jesus living with Mary for 30 years, that Mary saw a few things. Can you imagine like going for groceries as Jesus' mom is like, "We're out of milk. Jesus, instead of going to Costco, can you just do that thing again?" That would be amazing. You know, there was some point in Jesus' childhood where Mary saw some things where she's like, he can do things that other people can't do. He has solutions to things that I didn't know about. And so she brings this, what we would say, a pretty low-level issue to Jesus, and she said, "There's no more wine." And then Jesus responds by saying this, "Woman, why do you involve me?" You know, I tried referring to Lisa that way last week, and it didn't go over very well. You know, so we read this, we're like, man, that's offensive, like woman. And so cultural context, this isn't actually an offensive term. We could translate it as ma'am or my lady, or it's like it is more of a formal reference of honor and respect. Okay, so that's actually what it's saying. "Why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. And so in other words, like from the words of my son, what he loves to say, "Mary, this sounds like an issue, not an ish-me." It's an issue, not an ish-me. You figure it out. He says, "My hour has not yet come." And the hour that he's referring to is the time that is appointed for his death. As we'll see through John, that's what the hour represents. And just chronologically, the first two miracles that Jesus does, his hour isn't yet come. But the other ones, it's like now things are moving. Because Jesus knows that once he actually comes out publicly, that he can do miracles, that he can change things, that he has the light of life living within him. He knows as soon as that becomes known, then events are going to start to happen that are going to lead him to the crucifixion. That once he starts disrupting the reality of things, because as much as we think we wish that this wasn't true, when God disrupts this, it's disorienting, and actually people didn't like it. A lot of people didn't like it. And so Jesus knew, when this starts, everything is going to move towards the cross, and my hour hasn't yet come. I don't know if it's time for that yet. And Mary says, whatever. Mary says to the servants, "Just do whatever he tells you." And so she has some level of faith. You know, she gives Jesus the issue, and she's like, "It's not an ish-me, it's an issue. You figure it out, Jesus." And then she says to the other servants, "Just do what he tells you." And again, she's lived with him for 30 years. So she has some kind of faith and trust that Jesus is going to direct this thing in some way that is going to answer the solution or bring a solution to the problem. So do whatever he tells you. And we could talk a lot about this one line. But the reality is, for any of us in this room, coming back to where we started, if you're struggling with faith and belief, what you believe, what is true, Jesus would tell you Do what I tell you. Just try it. I'm going to digress just for a quick second. Listen to this. Jesus says, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Jesus a number of times alludes to this idea that if you want to actually know what is true, you don't wait to know or believe or intellectually sort something out towards you act. He says, experiment with it. Try it out. Try and live the way I'm calling you to live, and then what will you find to be true? And so Mary says, do whatever he tells you. And if you do whatever he tells you, I'm going to trust. This is what Mary's thinking. I'm going to trust that something is going to happen that's going to change your world and my world and this whole circumstance. So they go on, they do whatever he tells them to do, and this is the hinge point of whether a miracle or a sign is going to happen or not. Of course, the miracle was not going to happen without Jesus there, but I would argue that the miracle was also not going to happen unless somebody in the story did what Jesus told them to do. Both of those things were necessary for this story to unfold. So nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And so again, John does not put things in his story by accident. Throughout Scripture, 6 is a number that represents incompleteness. It's not whole. It's wanting, it's lacking. And so he says there's 6 water jars. And these water jars hold 20 to 30 gallons. And if you translate that to liters, we are talking about 180 of those 4-liter milk jugs. So we're talking potentially over 700 liters. I mean, that's a lot of wine. I mean, they got problems. And so imagine this. There was already wine. They already emptied the bottles. And so there's empties. There's empties lying around everywhere. They're partying. They're having a good time. And Jesus says, we could fill up those empty wine bottles. We could start there. Let's do it that way. But he says, no, let's pick those big, giant jars. They're empty. Let's fill those. And why was that important? Well, perhaps there was just so many people there. He needed the big jugs, and that was just more efficient. That might be one reason why he does it, very practical reason. I worked at camp for years. Just a real quick story. I worked at camp for years, and there was this lady that worked she was quite an old lady. She worked in the kitchen, and she didn't quite have a level of social awareness or appropriateness all the time. And we used to mix juice in these big jugs, they were huge, right? So you'd have these big spoons that you would mix them in. And I guess one day, maybe she couldn't find the big spoon. She came out of the kitchen. Her arm was purple up to her armpit. She said, "The juice is ready." I chose to have water that day. So Jesus says, get those big jugs. They're empty. Let's. We got a lot of wine or a lot of water to make. A lot of wine to make. Fill them with water though, because there's a lot of people. That's one level. But the second level is why would he choose these jugs? Because there's more going on here. These were jugs used for ceremonial washing. They weren't just water jars. They were used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. And so John is telling us something here. What is ceremonial washing? Well, when you were going to go into the temple, you needed to be clean, according to the law, according to the Torah. You needed to be clean before God. And so you would have to wash yourself before God so that you could be clean before God, so that you could be with God. And these jars are empty. So what is John telling us? You get all these different allusions, but part of what John is trying to help us understand is that the old system, the old law, the old way, the old covenant of coming before God and being right before God is empty. It doesn't work. There's no water and there's no life in there. In fact, that whole structure, that whole system of finding your way to God, we would learn as you read the New Testament that the whole thing was actually put in place for you to recognize your need for a Messiah, for your need for a new covenant, for your inability yourself to actually behave in a way that is right before God. And so Jesus says, let's fill those things. Let's fill those religious icons that are sacred and do something with them. It's sacrilegious. And not only that, he says, fill the jars with water, and it says they filled them to the brim. And you'll see throughout the Gospel of John that this theme is really important to John, that when Jesus does something, he just doesn't do something, it's like full on, it's overflowing, there's excess, there's leftovers. In a few weeks when we talk about the feeding of the 5,000, he does a thing and then there's leftovers. It's like, he doesn't just do the bare minimum, he does more than you could ask or imagine. So they fill them to the brim. In Jesus, there's a fullness of life. Jesus would say in John 10:10, I've come that you may have life in all of its fullness, Zoe in all of its fullness. And some of you maybe feel like you're empty this morning. Some of you, maybe you've tried this religion thing and there's no substance in it. The whole purpose of religion was that you would become aware that you need somebody on your behalf to bring you before God, to make you right before God, to make you clean before God, to sit in the presence of God. And so God, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us to do something new, to do something that we couldn't do. So fill them to the brim. And then he told them, now draw out some and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so. Right? They obeyed Jesus. They did what he told them to do. They listened to Mary. They listened to Jesus. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So he tasted the water, and this water had been turned into wine. And so not only was this done in these iconic religious symbols, but the wine itself is symbolic of something. And we could read a number of passages, but I'll read one here for you quick. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. Throughout the Old Testament, you see this reference to a future feast. And part of this future feast includes new wine, that God is going to do a new thing. And so John is helping us understand that God is invading the present and he's doing this new thing. The thing that's been alluded to from the prophets of past, that God's bringing it into the present. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. So what he's saying is usually how this works is you bring out the good wine and people get a little tipsy and drunk, and then you bring out the watered down wine and they don't care. They can't taste the difference. And that's the way it usually works. And this wedding planner, the bridegroom, says, this is the best wine. You saved the best till last. And so John is saying that this is pointing towards how God does things, our world. What do we experience in our world? Disorder, decay. I mean, if our world is left up just to itself, if we were to drop the ball, so to speak, over and over and over again, what does it mean? Disease, erosion, breakdown. The whole world is expanding. It's becoming disordered. It's pulling apart. Everything that's living has a life cycle, has a lifespan. Death. The Bible actually says that even though that's true, it doesn't deny that that's true, but it says that that's not the end of the story. That at the end of time, there's a feast. And this feast is a wedding banquet. A bride and a bridegroom that are coming together. Who's the bride? Who's the bridegroom? Well, the bridegroom is Jesus, and the bridegroom is his church. It's his people. And at the end of time, that there is a coming together, and that coming together, there's going to be a feast. We are going to feast together. And what is the world going to look like at that time? You read Revelation 21 as it's describing the reality of that time, that there'll be healing, there'll be restoration, there'll be no more crying, no more pain. The old order of things has passed away. This is what John writes in Revelation. The old order of things has passed away, and the new has come. And so all these things that are happening in the book of John are what? They're signs that are pointing to a future feast, a future wedding, a future celebration that renews and remakes everything. And then John says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. And his disciples what? Believed him. Back to John's theme. These signs revealed Jesus' glory. They pointed to something, and those who had eyes to see and ears to hear believed him. They put their trust in him. And John says, as we know, I'm writing this down so that you too would see, would hear, would believe, would trust in him and find life in his name. Now we can see what John is teaching us. Jesus invades history. And every sign that John is talking about isn't something that Jesus did, it's something that Jesus does. And I'm not talking about literally the wine thing, but the concept that Jesus renews, remakes, transforms, that he brings the future into the present. When we talk about the healing stories that happen that are on the board here, what are those healing stories? We could say those are the dunamis, those are the dynamite, those are the events. No, they're not the events. They are a sign that are pointing to a future reality where all people will be healed. All people will be restored. Relationships will be restored. There will be no more crying, no more war, no more death. Do you have eyes to see it and ears to hear it? John says, I hope you do. Bring your brain, bring your heart, trust me because I was there. And it's true, and it's still true. I want to invite you to stand with me. My hope as we go through the series is the same hope that John had, that as we read it, that we would believe, that we would see the sign that it's pointing to and not look at the present, but look into the future and dare to believe that God has good things in store. And that we would choose to co-partner with God, as we've been talking about this last series, that we pray that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What does that mean? That we are praying that future reality of God's kingdom into the present. We are living as citizens of the future into the present. And that these signs are pointing us in our hearts and our attention and our direction towards a future kingdom that is yet to come. And so some of you feel like nothing is changing in your world. Depression, anxiety, a diagnosis, cancer, chronic pain, relational breaking, violence, war. We think about everything happening in our world. In Canada, in Iran, in Israel, in Nigeria, in Ukraine. We could go over and over and over again. And John says, do you dare to believe that there's more to that than what you're seeing? Do you dare to believe that God would have something better in store? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.